Hey everyone, this is Andy with Mossy Creek Fly Fishing, bringing you a tying video today. Here in the vise I've got a Kreelex Gamechanger. This is sort of a mixture between Chuck Kraft's Kreelex and Blane Chocklett's Gamechanger. We're going to be using today a brush material that I made in another video. If you'd like to see how to make that, click the link that we will have somewhere on your screen there. I will show you in this video a way to tie this without the brush, but the brush will make your life a lot easier. So let's jump into this here. The first thing I'm going to do is place a shank in my vise. And what I'm using here is going to be a fish skull articulated shank, 15 millimeter. And every shank that I use from this point forward is going to be that shank. I've got UTC 140 denier thread. You can use other threads, but if you are going to be tying this with the technique I'll show you where you do not have a brush, you do need to ensure that you have a flat thread so that you're able to split the thread. Now, when I tie these, they take a bit of time, so I like to make them as tough as possible. So I like to come in right over those first wraps and put a little bit of that zap-a-gap on there and just make sure that that thread is solidly connected onto the shank. Now for the tail here, it's the only place in this fly that I'm not going to use a brush. What I'm going to do is get a little bit of my Kreinik material, and I'm going to just be able to trim this once it's tied in. But I'm going to get a fairly thin amount because I'm going to double this over. And you'll see there, that's kind of the thickness that I'm looking for. We can always trim some out, but that's about right. And I'll just grab myself a nice chunk to be able to work with fairly easily. And with my thread at about the halfway point on that shank, I'm going to come in and tie that Kreinik, half of it facing backwards, get a couple good locking wraps on there, and then I'm going to take this and I'm going to kind of fold that under and get it pinched and get a couple wraps on there. That gives us nice coverage on both the top and the bottom of the shank. Now I'll get a couple wraps on there, wrapping back on that shank. My tail length actually looks pretty good, and I can always trim this later, but I do like to come in and just get a nice, clean, even cut there. So we've got our tail, very easy. Again, I'm going to come in and just put a tiny dab of super glue on my thread there, help lock that stuff in place. Now at this point, we're going to start using some brush, and what I'm going to do is just use my thread to sort of smooth out that front there so that I've got a decent smooth drop. I don't have one big fall off point. Now the first brush I'm going to use is this 1 inch that I made in the other video. Again, if you want to see how to make this, you can click the link that we've got down in the description. And I've got a pretty long wire tag there, so I'll just come in with some crummy scissors and snip that off. And I'll come and I'll tie that in right back to my tail here. So that's in there, that's ready to go, and I'm going to advance my thread right up towards the eye of that shank. Now when I go to wrap this, like a lot of other things, I'm going to wrap and I'm going to preen back my fibers so that each wrap is right in front of the last, and I'm trying my best to not trap too many fibers here. So as we move up the shank, you'll see that Kreinik material is flaring nicely. We're getting a nice body built here in the back of the fly, and we'll come right up here, right to the eye of the hook. That's plenty. And I'm going to come and wrap through my brush a couple times behind it, preen back my fibers, get a few wraps in front of it. Now once I have that done, I'm going to come in with some wire cutting scissors and snip that off close. And again, I'll preen back these fibers and get a little bit of a cleaner head on it. I'm not going to worry too much about a real beautiful head there. This is all going to get covered up. Now I'll come in and I'll throw a little whip finish into here. Now again, just in the name of keeping this fly nice and solid, I am going to come and I'll hit this with just a little bit of super glue. Got too much there, so I'll just come in with my finger, get that off, and come in with my bodkin, make sure the eye of that shank is not filled up too much. Again, this is all going to get covered, so I really don't spend a whole lot of time worrying about it being perfect. Now I'm going to come in and I'm going to put this second shank here into the vise. Sometimes these smaller shanks can be a bit hard to get separated, but I use a bit of fingernail and get it into there. And I'm actually going to go ahead and take that out and put my front shank in there. So now I'm ready to tie this next spot, but I like to come in and do some trim work on the previous shank prior to tying on this one. Now, one thing I like to do as I tie these is I trim as I go. So I'm going to make some small trimming adjustments here, and as I build the body of the fly, I'm going to be trimming consistently all the way back, making sure my taper is nice throughout. Now for this one, I'm going to make a slimmer profile bait fish. You can leave it wider if you want. You know, if you wanted to imitate something like a sucker, you might leave it a bit wider, but I'm going to turn my vise and I'm just going to cut back at a little bit of an angle here on the side. And I'll do the same on my other side here. And I'm not worried about perfection at this point. We're just trying to sort of get off a decent bit of this excess material, and then I will come back in as we go along here. So now I'll trim my top and bottom a little bit. Notice my scissors are taking a bit of an angle towards that tail here. And I'll do the same on the bottom. I find the bottom's the hardest part to trim, but it's one of those deals just like anything else. Take your time. I sort of trim a square first, and then I come in and trim off those edges. And we're going to be trimming this consistently as we tie the fly. So again, I don't need it to be 100% perfect. So now I'll come back in with my thread here, start it on my next shank, and get that trimmed off. Again, I'm going to come and place just a bit of super glue on there and cover the rest of that shank with my thread. Now for this shank, I'm going to show y'all how you could do this if you didn't have the brush. This is a bit more time consuming, like I said, but it is a way to tie this fly without making the brush first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a split thread technique. So I'll start by making sure my thread is nice and flat. And to do that, oftentimes I'll just take my bodkin and my finger and sort of run it down that thread. And you'll notice my bobbin down here is starting to spin in the direction it needs to flatten that thread out. So as I continue to do this, I'm getting flatter and flatter, starting to get to where it's going to be easy to split. And right about there should be good. I'll come in and try to get the middle of that as best I can. And I'll just hold open a loop with my fingers there. Now I'm going to come over here and grab my hank of Kreinik, and I'll try to find an area where my ends are fairly aligned, and I'll get myself a decent chunk of this material. Let's see here. So that looks pretty good. Let me just trim my ends up. I'm going to go ahead and I'll just place that into my thread best you can, and I'll pull that thread tight. So now I've got that material held into my thread there. Again, you'll notice as I do this, it's definitely easier to make those brushes first and not have to worry about all this. Sometimes I'll just come in and I'll hold that in a nice clump there so that I can come and trim off my other side, and then I'll come back and sort of reposition things, get it in the middle nicely, and I'll sort of spread that material out, get it a little bit cleaner. And I'm going to start to shorten up my thread here and start spinning my bobbin up. Now I like to really hold this material in place so I don't lose a ton of it as I do this. But you'll notice again, this is much more time consuming than using the brush. But you'll see once I get to that point, I do get those fibers to flare out nicely. And I'm going to get that nice and spun up here. Keep going until I have that really solidly held in there. And now this is a bit long, so I'm going to do just a little bit of preemptive trimming on either side here. This does not need to be clean at all. We're going to trim afterwards, but just to get a little bit of my bulk out, we'll trim that up. And I like to tug on those, make sure they're held in there solidly. I'm going to do a few more spins. That should be good. And I'll wrap back again towards the start of that shank, and I'll do the same exact thing. So I'm just preening back my fibers as I go. Now, one thing you'll notice when you do it this way is it's pretty difficult to get enough thread or enough material in just one go. So I'm going to spin my bobbin back, flatten it back out, and we'll do that one more time. Starting to get flatter there, so I'll go back to that technique I used before and just use my bodkin and my finger to tease that thread and get my bobbin spinning to where it flattens out nicely. You'll notice there, looking at the fly the way I have it, when you do it this way, it's much harder to have those lengths predicted like you can do with building a brush. But again, it is a way you can make this fly without going through the brush making process. So let me go in here and split that thread again. Get it in half there. Same deal, I'll come over here to my Kreinik, get it cleaned up a little bit. Get it into my thread loop there. And trim off the excess. Now I'll hold my bobbin tight, trying to hold that material in there, and I'll spread it out, get it nice and even. And as I make my first spins, I'll hold my finger there, which really helps hold that thread tight. And I get that spun up a little ways, and then when I let go and pull, you'll see that spins up really nicely. And we'll just keep going until those are fully locked again. You could use a dubbing loop for this as well if you wanted to. I find it just as easy, maybe a little bit quicker to use this route, but it's up to you, whatever you prefer there. Pull out a couple loose fibers and spin this up a few more times just to make sure we're really solid. And that should be good. And we'll just come back to where we were. I'm going to come in and trim this all here in a second, so I'm not going to worry about it to start. Same deal as before. We'll clean up our head just a little bit here. Not too worried about that being super pretty. Before I whip finish, I like to flatten my thread back out just a bit. Otherwise, it has a tendency to want to jump as I do the whip finish. And now I'll come in and just do a little whip finish here. Pull that tight. Cut off my thread, and like before, put just a little drop of Zap-A-Gap on there to hold that in securely. So now, when I do it this way, I really like to come in with a dubbing brush and get all those fibers that may be trapped out of underneath of themselves. So I'll just brush at that a little bit, and now I've got some serious trim work I need to do. So what I'll do is I'll kind of preen these fibers back so I can get a better purchase on them with the scissors. And I'll just line up with my last cuts, and I'll come in And again, I'm making rough cuts at this point. So make that side, try to even it up on the other side here. Take a look at our underneath. Sometimes I'll pinch the fibers and give myself a little help. I'll show you all here in a second. There's a way that this is easier when we actually take it out of the vise, but I'll just do some of my first trims while it's in there. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually put another shank in here. Now I'm not going to be tying on this shank, but I'm just going to use this to hold while I trim so I can get a good look at this. So I'll take it out and I'll look at it sort of up and down like that, and I still need to take off quite a bit. So one thing you'll see me do is take my fingers and I'll pinch that right there. So now I have a nice clean top and bottom that I can come in and do a pretty easy cut on. So I'll hold my angle and I'll come in here and make that trim. Now I'm going to flip this over, do the same thing on the underside. So I'm pinching that between a few fingers. You can see how long those fibers are. And I'll just trim that right down to the tail. So now that's my top and bottom. Again, we're fairly rough cut right now. And then I'm going to come in on the sides. I like the sides of this to be fairly thin profile. We're going to sink better if we have a little bit more of a thinner profile. So if you want to get more depth, keep that fly a little bit thinner. Whereas if you want to push some serious water, you can keep it a little bit thicker. So now I'm trimming up that other side. So now that I've got the bulk of that big trimming done, I'm going to come and just take a look at it, and it's far from perfect, but it's good enough to where I can move on to the next step, and then we'll continue to trim this as we tie through the rest of the fly. So what I'm actually going to do now is take this size 4 SL45 Gamakatsu hook, and I am going to place that into my vise. And at this point, it's up to you. You can add some lead wire if you'd like. I'm going to put a little bit on there using this 0.015 lead wire. I've got that on that Renzetti lead wire bobbin. And I'm just going to do enough to cover up kind of the front, or the middle, I should say, of this hook. Just enough that when I fish this fly, I'm going to be putting a eye on the front of it, or a cone head on the front of it, I should say. And this is going to give me just a little weight in the back of the fly so that it sinks a little bit more evenly. So now I'll come in with my thread, same thread here, get that started right in front of the lead, and then I'm going to do some wraps to lock that lead in place there. And I'll cover that up nicely. Now I'm going to bring my thread all the way back, right back to the end of the hook, and again I'll come in with my Zap-A-Gap and get some coverage on there. And I like to just kind of wrap through that glue, make sure I'm really solidly secured. And the way I'm going to connect the back portion of this fly to the front is by actually tying a shank onto it. So I'm going to take that shank and lay it to where it's going to be in line with my hook shank. So that looks pretty good right there. And I'm just going to wrap this on just like you would anything else. So we're wrapping that shank up nice and tight. You'd be surprised how well this holds. And the reason I like to do it this way is that that nice opening back here really allows for a lot more movement than if we had a wire that was pulled tight. It's also a little bit stronger. You don't have to worry about anything breaking on you. And I've just come to tie most of my game changers in this style. So I get that completely wrapped up here, cover all of that shank. And then I'll come in with glue one more time. Now from this point forward on the fly, we're going to just continue to do these same pieces. We're going to tie in and we're going to trim. We're going to tie in and we're going to trim. So we'll fast forward through a little bit of this and we will come back in once we get to our last hook here. So I'll go ahead and tie this one in and I'll talk with y'all more once we get through this section. One more thing I will mention is that if you are using brush, this is going to be the last shank where I use this 1-inch brush, and then I'm going to transition over to my bigger 2-inch brush there. So before I tie that in, I'll pluck away at a couple feathers or flash here, and I'll tie that in right there at the hook and wrap back. All right, and now like I said, we're just going to continue to do these same pieces. So we'll be wrapping this up. We'll fast forward here through the next shank or two, and then I'll come back to you guys here in a little bit. All right, so now we're ready to do our front hook. So I'm going to use this Gamakatsu hook in a 2/0. You could use a lot of others here. B10S is another great hook. And I'm going to go ahead and put this size large tungsten cone head on there. You can tie this without the cone head if you'd like, totally up to you. These cone heads, I will say, do not like to fit onto that shank, but if you give them a little bit of a push, they'll get past that barb easily. And we'll also, oftentimes I'll come in and just crimp that barb, especially when I get to where I'm going to tie the or fish the fly. Now I'm going to take my lead again and dress the shank with about 10, 12 wraps, enough that I can sort of jam it up into the eye of this cone head. So right there, I push it up into the cone head, and I'd like a few more, so I'll take my tag and just wrap that back a little ways. I like to get to about that halfway point on my shank, and then I'll take that off. And I'll start my thread right behind it here, build up a bit of a dam. And we'll trim that free. Now I'm going to go ahead and just cover up all that lead, lock it in place. Don't need to be perfectly clean here. And then, like I've been doing, put a bit of glue right there on the shank. And now, just like we did on that last hook, I've taken a 15mm shank and placed it into the eye of the last one. And I'm going to connect that right on top of our hook here. And we'll wrap that back. Now watch yourself at this point. It's easy to break your thread on some of the hard edges of these shanks. I've done that many times, but as we get these wraps on here, this becomes really solidly connected, and I've never had one come free. So bear with me here. I'm going to really cover up this shank and get everything nice and secure. You'll see right up here where the eye of that shank is, I've built up quite a bit of thread just to get that covered up and have a smoother transition as I come down to that cone head there. There we go. Now I'll wrap back through all that again. And this one I definitely want to super glue just to really lock all that thread super nice and tight so that if you have a fish hooked on that back hook, you don't need to worry about anything pulling out here. And there we go. Now I've definitely still got some trim work to do here on the back of the fly, but I'm going to get the rest of this tied up and then we'll trim it all as one unit. So I'll come in here again with that longer brush that I made. Attach that right back at the base of the shank there. And we're going to be wrapping this right up to the cone head. So you could add some fins with, a feather or something if you wanted to, but I really like to keep this fly just as a whole flash kind of Kreelex look to it. And we'll wrap these up just like we've been doing here. So we'll do touching wraps, preening back our fibers as we go. The denser you get this, the better it's going to kind of splay out in the water and stay supported. If you don't have much density, your fibers are going to sort of collapse on themselves. So you do want to make sure you're getting those wraps one right next to the other. It looks like I'll have just enough brush to get through to the end of this. I'm going to wrap this right up tight to the cone head here. And I like to really force a few more wraps in there. Give that a nice solid collar. And now I'll come in and trap that off. Get a few locking wraps in front of it. And I'll go ahead and trim off that last little bit of brush there. Now I'll go ahead and just wrap behind that cone head a couple times with my thread and make sure everything's nice and secure. And we'll go ahead and whip finish, and this will really be the last bit of tying we do on this fly. I'll do 2 just for extra security purposes, but we do still have quite a bit of trim work to do, so we're not done quite yet here. Trim that off, and again, I'll just drop some super glue onto here. There we go. If you get a little bit on your fibers, you don't need to worry about it too much, but careful that you don't get it too spread out on those. There we go. All right, so we're looking good here. This is a bit wider than I'd like it to be, and I'm gonna start from the head, and I'm actually gonna trim my way back, because now I can look at this as one full unit here. So the head's pretty easy. What I like to do is I come in with my scissors at a bit of an angle like this, and I'll just trim as I turn that fly in my vise. So this head here, I'm really taking off a decent bit of material to build that sort of cone tapered shape, almost following the taper of my cone head. And once I feel like that's getting to about where I like it, again, I'll sort of preen back my fibers and look at my fly. I like to come look at it from the top. And we're looking pretty good, but I could take off some of the sides still. So I'm going to start here at the head. Give it my trim up work on both sides, trying to keep everything even. And then I'm just going to take my scissors and sort of walk my way down this fly. You'll notice I'm holding back here, keeping everything nice and tight. That's going to help you a lot with your trimming. And back here by the base of the fly, you'll see we really are getting that pretty darn thin back there. And again, it's up to you what profile you want to go for. I like this little bit of a thinner profile here, but fish will eat it in a lot of different ways. I've tied this in a really big game changer and fished them for musky. This is a size I'll use for smallmouth, trout, you know, kind of some of your more mid-range size fish. That side's looking a little better. Now I'm going to come in and get this side, working down it, walking my way down, just continuing my taper all the way to my tail here. And this is one of those flies, you can trim it forever. I do tend to probably put in a little bit more trim work than I might need to, but as a tire, I like to have it looking good enough that when I see it in my box, I want to grab it. So, you know, I'll let you kind of decide where you want to stop at your trimming. Profile is getting close to where we want it now. Still got a couple pieces that are going a little bit awry on me. That's looking good. Now at this point, a lot of the times I'll take it out of the vise and I'll set it in my hand, kind of look at it. I'd still like to take the back of that down a little bit. If I show y'all another one that I tied and finished, you'll see that taper comes to a little bit more of a halt back there, a little bit shallower, and you can look at that head on and see kind of the profile that we're looking for there. So I'm going to come back to this one and keep doing a little more work to it. Sometimes what I find too is helpful is if I take my brush, watch your back hook there, and brush all this out. It gives me a little bit easier time when I come back with the scissors. All right. Trim up my head a little more here. We're getting pretty close now. Again, I could trim this for hours, but for the sake of the video, I'm not going to worry about going all the way entirely perfect, but hopefully it'll give you a good idea of what you're looking for here. That's looking about right there. So just to show y'all, there's kind of the profile I have on this one. It's a little bit thicker than my other, but should fish pretty well. There you go. These, when they move in the water, really give a unique look. This flash, as it turns, will flash just like the scales of a fish. You'll have it, whereas depending on the light and how it hits it, y'all might be able to see it here. It can be more dull from the backside, and it can be flashier from the sides. So you get a really unique look from this material. This Kreinik is just a super unique material that there's nothing really else out there that does exactly what it does and behaves like it. So that's the fly there. Hope y'all tie one up and enjoy it. We've been out fishing it quite a bit and catching some nice browns on it. Works great in a little bit of higher water. Tie it in whatever size you want though. If you tie a small one, it'll work well in some of your more low and clear water. So there you go, Kreelex Gamechanger. This one's in gold. We've got Kreinik in all sorts of different colors, so you can get really personal with this and kind of tie it however you'd like. So thanks for watching. And If you guys tie some up and do well, let us know.